Permanent record by Edward Snowden, Session 13, NDOC. You know that once establishing shot that's in pretty much every spy movie and TV show that's subtitled CIA Headquarters, Langley, Virginia. And then the camera moves through the marble lobby with the wall of stars and the floor with the agency's seal. Well, Langley is the site's historical name, which the agency prefers Hollywood to use. CIA headquarters is officially in McLean, Virginia, and nobody really comes through that lobby except VIPs or outsiders on a tour. That building is the OHB, the Old Headquarters Building, the building where almost everybody who works at the CIA enters is far less ready for its close-up. The new headquarters building, my first day was one of the very few I spent there in daylight. That said, I spent most of the day underground in a grimy, cinder block walled room with all the charm of a nuclear fallout shelter and the acrid smell of government bleach. So, this is the deep state, one guy said, and almost everybody laughed. I think he would been expecting a circle of Ivy League wasps chanting in hoods, whereas I had been expecting a group of normie civil service types who resembled younger visions of my parents. Instead, we were all computer dudes, and yes, almost uniformly dudes, who were clearly wearing business casual for the first time in our lives. Some were tattooed and pious or bore evil evidence of having removed their piercings for the big day. One still had punky streaks of dye in his hair. Almost all wore contractor badges as green and crisp as new $100 bills. We certainly didn't look like a hermetic power mad cabal that controlled the actions of America's elected officials from shadowy subterranean cubicles. The session was the first stage in our transformation. It was called the Indoc or indoctrination, and its entire point was to convince us that we were the elite, that we were special, that we had been chosen to be privy to the mysteries of the state and to the truths that the rest of the country, and at times even its Congress and courts, couldn't handle. I couldn't help but think while I sat through this indoc that the presenters were preaching to the choir. You don't need to tell a bunch of computer whizzes that they possess superior knowledge and skills that uniquely qualify them to act independently and make decisions on behalf of their fellow citizens without any oversight or review. Nothing inspires arrogance like a lifetime spent controlling machines that are incapable of criticism. This, to my thinking, actually represented the great nexus of the intelligence community and the tech industry. Both are entrenched and unelected powers that pride themselves on maintaining absolute secrecy about their developments. Both believe that they have the solutions for everything, which they never hesitate to unilaterally impose. Above all, they both believe that these solutions are inherently apolitical because they are based on data whose prerogatives are regarded as preferable to the chaotic whims of the common citizen. Being indoctrinated into the IC, like becoming expert at technology, has powerful psychological effects. All of a sudden, you have access to the story behind the story, the hidden histories of well known or supposedly well known events. That can be intoxicating, at least for a teetotaler like me. Also, all of a sudden you have not just the license but the obligation to lie, conceal, dissemble, and dissimulate. This creates a sense of tribalism which can lead many to believe that their primary allegiance is to the institution and not to the rule of law. I wasn't thinking any of these thoughts at my indoc session, of course. Instead, I was just trying to keep myself awake as the presenters proceeded to instruct us on basic operational security practices. Part of the wider body of spy techniques, the IC collectively describes as tradecraft. These are often so obvious as to be mind numbing. Don't tell anyone who you work for. Don't leave sensitive materials unattended. Don't bring your highly insecure cell phone into the highly secure office or talk onto it about work ever. Don't wear your "Hi, I work for the CIA" badge to the mall. Finally, the litany ended. The lights came down, the PowerPoint was fired up, and faces appeared on the screen that was bolted to the wall. Everyone in the room sat upright. These were the faces, we were told, of former agents and contractors who, whether through greed, malice, incompetence, or negligence, failed to follow the rules. They thought they were above all this mundane stuff, and their hubris resulted in their imprisonment and ruin. The people on the screen, it was implied, were now in basements even worse than this one, and some would be there until they died. All in all, this was an effective presentation. I'm told that in the years since my career ended, this parade of horribles, of incompetents, moles, defectors, and traitors has been expanded to include an additional category: people of principle, whistleblowers in the public interest. I can only hope that the 20 somethings sitting there today are struck by the government's conflation of selling secrets to the enemy and disclosing them to journalists when when my face pop up on the screen. I came to work for the CIA when it was at the nadir of its morale. Following the intelligence failures of 9/11, Congress and the executive had set out on an aggressive reorganization campaign. It included stripping the position of Director of Central Intelligence of its dual role as both head of the CIA and head of the entire American IC, a dual role that the position had held since the founding of the agency in the aftermath of World War II. When George Tenet was forced out in 2004, the CIA's half-century supremacy over all other agencies went with him. The CIA's rank and file considered Tenet's departure and the directorship demotion as merely the most public symbols of the agency's betrayals by the political class it had been created to serve. The general sense of having been manipulated by the Bush administration and then blamed for its worst excess gave rise to a culture of victimization and retrenchment. This was only exacerbated by the appointment of Porter Goss, an undistinguished former CIA officer turned Republican congressman from Florida. As the agency's new director, the first to serve in the reduced position, the installation of a politician was taken as a chastisement and as an attempt to weaponize the CIA by putting it under partisan supervision. Director Goss immediately began a sweeping campaign of firings, layoffs, and forced retirements that left the agency understaffed and more reliant than ever on contractors. Meanwhile, the public at large had never had such a low opinion of the agency or such insight into its inner workings. Thanks to all the leaks and disclosures about its extraordinary renditions and some black site presence. At the time, the CIA was broken into five directorates. There was the DO, the Directorate of Operations, which was responsible for the actual spying, the TI, Directorate of Intelligence, which was responsible for synthesizing and analyzing the results of that spying, the DST, the Directorate of Science and Technology, which built and supplied computers, communication devices, and weapons to the spies and showed them that how to use them. The DA, Directorate of Administration, which basically meant lawyers, human resources, and all those who coordinated the daily business of the agency and served as a liaison to the government. And finally, the DS, Directorate of Support, which was a strange directorate and back then the largest. The DS included everyone who worked for the agency in a support capacity, from the majority of the agency's technologists and medical doctors to the personnel in the cafeteria and the gym and the guards and at the gate. The primary function of the DS was to manage the CIA's global communications infrastructure, the platform ensuring that the spies reports got to the analyst and that the analyst report got to the administrators. The DS housed the employees who provided technical support throughout the agency, maintained the servers, and kept them secure. The people who built, serviced, and protected the entire network of the CIA and connected it with the networks of the other agencies and controlled their access. These were, in short, the people who used technology to link everything together. It should be no surprise, then, that the bulk of them were young. It should also be no surprise that most of them were contractors. My team was attached to the Directorate of Support, and the task was to manage the CIA's Washington Metropolitan Server architecture, which is to say the vast majority of the CIA servers in the continental United States. The enormous halls of expensive big iron computers that comprise the agency's internal networks and databases, all of its systems that transmitted, received, and sorted intelligence. Though the CIA had dotted the country with relay servers, many of the agency's most important servers were situated on site. Half of them were in the NHB, where my team was located. The other half were in the nearby OHB. They were set up on opposite sides of their respective buildings so that if one side was blown up, we wouldn't lose too many machines. My TS or SCI security clearance reflected my having been read into a few different compartments of information. Some of these compartments were signed signal, intelligence, or intercepted communications, and another was HUMINT, human intelligence, or the work done and reports filed by agents and analysts. The CIA's work routinely involves both. On top of those, I was read into a ComSec, Communications Security compartment that allowed me to work with cryptographic key material, the codes that have traditionally been considered the most important agency secrets because they are used to protect all other agencies' secrets. This cryptographic material was processed and stored on and around the servers I was responsible for managing. My team was one of the few at the agency permitted to actually lay hands on these servers, and likely the only team with access to login to nearly all of them. In the CIA, secure offices are called vaults, and my team's vault was located a bit past the CIA's help desk section. During the daytime, the help desk was staffed by a busy contingent of older people, close to my parents' age. They wore blazers and slacks and even blouses and skirts. This was one of the few places in the CIA tech world at the time where I recall seeing a sizable number of women. Some of them had the blue badges that identified them as government employees, or as contractors called them, govies. They spent their shifts picking up banks of ringing phones and talking people in the building or out in the field through their tech issues. It was a sort of icy version of call center work, resetting passwords, unlocking accounts, and going by rote through the troubleshooting checklist. Can you log out and back in? Is the network capable plugged in? If the GUIs, with their minimal tech experience, couldn't deal with a particular issue themselves, they would escalate it to more specialized teams, especially if the problem was happening in the foreign field, meaning CIA stations overseas in places like Kabul or Baghdad or Bogota or Paris. I'm a bit ashamed to admit how proud I felt when I first walked through this gloomy array. I was decades younger than the help desk folks and heading past them into a world to which they didn't have access and never would. At the time, it hadn't yet occurred to me that the extent of my access meant that the process itself might be broken, that the government had simply given up on meaning fully managing and promoting its talent from within because the new contracting culture meant they no longer had to care. More than any other memory I have of my career, this route of mine past the CIA help desk has come to symbolize for me the generational and cultural change in the IC of which I was a part. The moment when the old school prepster clique that traditionally staffed the agencies, desperate to keep pace with technologies they could not be bothered to understand, welcomed a new wave of young hackers into the institutional fold and let them develop, have complete access to, and wield complete power over unparalleled technological system of state control. In time, I came to love the help desk govies, who were kind and generous to me and always appreciated my willingness to help even when it wasn't my job. I, in turn, learned much from them, in bits and pieces, about how larger organizations function beyond the Beltway. Some of them have actually worked out in the foreign lands themselves once upon a time. Like the agents they know now assisted over the phone, after a while they had come back home to the States, not always with their families intact, and they had been relegated to the help desk for the remaining years of their careers because they lacked the computer skills required to compete in an agency increasingly focused on expanding its technological capabilities. I was proud to have won the Govi's respect, and I was never quite comfortable with how many of my team members condescendingly pitied and even made fun of these bright and committed folks. Men and women who, for low pay and little glory, had given the agency years of their lives, often in inhospitable and even outright dangerous places abroad, at the end of which their ultimate reward was a job picking up phones in a lonely halfway hallway.